Good evening, folks. Thank you for coming tonight. It's our privilege here at St. James to host Ukraine Why this evening. My name is Reverend Rick Brown. I'm the minister here at St. James. This event began as a brainstorm over lunch with Nathan Tidridge and I just last week. We were just sitting around trying to figure out what we could do for the Waterdown community that would be helpful. I think public displays, marches, and protests and events like that are really helpful for raising awareness, but I get the feeling we're all very aware of what is going on in the Ukraine. And we were trying to decide if there was something we could do to be even more helpful. And we thought an opportunity to hear an expert speaker with historical knowledge into the background of Ukraine that could help us maybe understand a little bit of the context of what has led to the conflict and war in Ukraine might be helpful, and perhaps a political perspective might be helpful, and just a place where people can come, hear, listen, say what's on your mind, say what is on your heart, ask questions. If you have some, we wanted to be able to present that opportunity. And sometimes, too, when you get a bunch of people in the same room talking about the same thing, ideas for further action just kind of come out of the conversation. And if that happens tonight, too, if this spawns or prompts ideas for more things that we as the Waterdown community can do in support of the Ukrainian people, then that is a blessing as well. We are set up through the United Church of Canada to handle cash donations. You can do that either with real old-fashioned paper cash. There will be a plate at the back door if you wish to donate to that, and that will be handled through the United Church of Canada. Or if you wish to donate by plastic, you can go to our website, stjameswaterdown.ca. And Kyle, do we have a slide with the address? Not yet? Okay. So I forgot to prompt Kyle for that. Or just Google St. James United Church Waterdown. That's the easiest way to find us. Google St. James United Church Waterdown. At the top of the page, you will see a button that says Donate. And when you click through on that donate, it'll give you an opportunity to add a note and just put in the note field Ukraine donation, and it will go to the right place. So you can do that with plastic online. It's my pleasure to introduce our co-host for the evening, Governor General Award-winning history teacher from Waterdown High School, Nathan Tidridge, who is going to introduce our guest speaker for the evening.
Thank you, Rick. As a teacher at Waterdown High, I am very excited by our speaker because I'm trying to help our students navigate through what is happening in Europe right now. And so I brought my book to take as many notes as possible from Dr. Payton's address. I'm very honored to introduce him to you. Dr. Payton is the Professor Emeritus of History at Redeemer University. He has taught for over 30 years in the areas of Eastern European history, Ukrainian history, and the Eastern Orthodox Church. He recently came out of retirement to join the McMaster Divinity College as a professor of patristics and historical theology. We live in an age where anyone who is anyone has a Wikipedia page, and Professor Payton is one of those people, so he is a somebody. His impressive career of study covers areas that are very much relevant to what is going on in the world today. He has written extensively on his areas of interest, including most recently his publication, The Unknown Europe, How Eastern Europe Got That Way. And I was just handed my copy by my dear friend Carl Draxler, from him and his wife Janice Draxler, who are partly responsible for this night happening as well. So I will look forward to getting Dr. Payton to sign that at the end of the night. When he retired from Redeemer, the university issued a wonderful tribute, and I read it yesterday evening. And the one line that really stuck out for me, it said that Dr. Payton is beloved by his students for his wit, his care, and his passion for history. And so with that, I am very much looking forward to his presentation. Sir.
Well, thank you for coming and for your interest. As Nathan said, I did teach at Redeemer University in Eastern European history for nigh on 30 years in Eastern Orthodoxy and related fields. And so working in this area made what's going on very real to me and very close. I am not Ukrainian, but I did travel there, got this when I did, and ended up being in Kiev, eventually in Crimea while it was still in Ukraine, and then engaging in a conference there as well. So I have Ukrainian friends there and here, as well as some Russian friends as well. Let me start off by doing what I used to say at the beginning of every one of my Eastern European history classes. No matter which one it was, I'd start off something like this. Nothing in Ukraine and Russia both fit into the larger category of Eastern Europe. I would say nothing in Eastern Europe happened yesterday. Everything happened centuries ago, and we're just seeing the ripple effects of it again. Now, that's an overstatement, but it's a way of helping us who live in North America realize history is different over there. For us in Canada and the U.S., our forebears that came from Europe and colonized this area, Turtle Island as the indigenous peoples called it, came over maybe 400 years ago. So if we're talking about history and we go all the way back to the Second World War, that's pretty good. Back to the First World War in 1914 to 1918, that's really going pretty far back. In Eastern Europe, all the peoples in the entire region, with the exception of one, have lived where they are for at least 1,400 years with their neighbors, with invaders or others. The one that's an exception, the newcomer on the block, are the Magyars, the Hungarians. They came 1,300 years ago. Things that happened back then, often centuries ago, are still impacting the way people see things in the present day. And that's definitely the case with Ukraine and Russia. I've been watching what's been building up over the last few months. And when the invasion took place, I told some friends, I'm sad, I'm disappointed, but I'm not surprised. Now, let's try to get into it. If we can get the first slide up. This is just, in general, what we're going to be talking about. Then the next one after that. So this is just, in general, a map of Europe. Here is Ukraine. Obviously, Russia is over here. You realize Russia goes all the way to the Bering Sea. It covers 11 time zones. It's the biggest landmass country in the world. So this is Russia, the part that we're dealing with. Ukraine is right here. If we put the next map up, it makes it easier to see because you don't have all the cities' names. You have Ukraine here, just north of the Black Sea, north of where Turkey is, and then Russia here. Here is where you see it. And you can see the rest of Europe nearby. You see Belarus, Poland, and so on, some of these other countries that are factoring in the news as well in the present day. So we're talking about Ukraine. If we go to the next slide, that'll help us see a present day closer map of it. You see how Kiev is spelled, and some other matters as well. These are Ukrainian spellings brought over into our characters, not using the kind of characters. They use the other alphabet like the Russians do and so many of the Eastern Europeans. But it brought over into English, that's the way it's spelled, and that takes us to the next slide. We'll come back to a couple of these. The capital city, you may have been confused by this. Some of my friends have been. The capital city of Ukraine is called Kyiv. Not James. The capital city is called Kyiv in Ukrainian. In Russian, it's called Kiev. Now, slightly different. But the way in which the Ukrainians pronounce it is Kyiv. An I, as in so many other languages, is like a long E sound. In the Russian sound, it's not Kiev. You kind of slide into the E. It's Kiev. Sounds a lot alike, but it is different in that regard. So you say, well, why is that a big deal? It's not necessarily a big deal, but you'll run into both languages. Obviously, Ukrainians prefer this usage, though that one is the one that was used for centuries because of Russian control and Russian being dominant in that area. If we go to the next slide, this will take us where we're going to get close. Kievan Rus is the name of a country I'm going to talk about in just a minute. The Ukrainian name for it is Kievan Rus, okay? You've probably never heard of it because it's in Eastern Europe. Part of what I get at in my book, The Unknown Europe, How Eastern Europe Got That Way, is that in the West, for a variety of reasons, we've not learned much about Eastern Europe. But in Eastern Europe, Kievan Rus was a major state from the 900s till 1240. Not only a major state, it was the largest state in all of Europe. In all of Europe. If we go back to a couple slides earlier, just pick one on Kiev itself. If we go back to, and I'll try to give a kind of a rough indication of, in an earlier map of the size of Kievan Rus, and then I'm going to say something more about why it was so significant. Before that one then. Yeah, okay. Kievan Rus would have included all of that. By far, the largest state at the time in all of Europe. Not just the largest. It was also the most sophisticated after the Byzantine Empire. Now, it doesn't show it here, but we in the West have learned that the Roman Empire fell in the 400s. It did in the West. It continued in the East, called the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, for another 1,000 years. So it continued as on a Christian basis down in this area and across on the other side of the Mediterranean. It was very sophisticated, but among the states that were just in Europe, Kievan Rus was the most sophisticated. Let me give you a couple of examples. A man who ruled, the man who ruled from 1019 to 1054, you think, gosh, that's a long time ago. We're talking Eastern Europe. This is yesterday. He ruled from 1019 to 1054, Yaroslav. In his royal court, boys and girls were taught to read and write 3 languages: Greek, Latin, and Slavonic, the general Slavic language at the time. 150 years later, when the Magna Carta was signed, you know that's a big deal for us in the West, King John I of England signed it with an X because he couldn't read or write. This is a sophisticated state. They'd drawn from the Christian civilization of Byzantium, expanded it, and they had education for boys and girls. Education for girls wouldn't develop for another 400 years at best, at the earliest in the West. This is sophisticated. Not just that. Everybody wanted to be connected to Yaroslav. In fact, he was called the father-in-law of Europe because of his 6 kids. One daughter was married to the king of Norway. One daughter was married to the king of Hungary. One daughter was married to the king of France, and she was thought a witch because she could sign her name. One son was married to the daughter of the king of Poland. One son was married to a major potentate in Saxony, and another was married somewhere else. But he was the father-in-law of Europe. They had contacts with all the rest of Europe. And the other thing that's significant here is that this is a committedly Christian state. In the 35 years that he ruled Kievan Rus, but he ruled from Kiev, Yaroslav saw to it that 400 churches were built in Kiev alone. But 400 churches, that's one for every 100 citizens in Kiev. There were about 40,000 people, which by the standards of the time, that was 4 times the size of what Paris and London could master. They only had about 10,000 people. Now, the reason this is significant is that Yaroslav and his father, rather through his father Vladimir, Kievan Rus had turned to Eastern Christianity, not to medieval Catholicism, but to Eastern Christianity. At the time, the two pretty much got along. They developed in separate ways after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. They lost contact, But they were basically about as similar as Baptists and Methodists might be in the States, or Anglicans and United Church up here. They shared respect for each other, and they got along pretty well, but they had turned toward Eastern Orthodoxy. Very important to keep that in mind. In any event, this is a flourishing state, very well connected, respected in West and East alike, with contacts in Europe as we would know it, and further to the East. And they engaged in trade with Muslim territories south of Turkey and further into the Middle East. They engaged in trade with people from Germany, with a Jewish kingdom nearby. There were a group of people who would convert, the Khazars, who had converted to Judaism. They had a flourishing trade empire until 1240. Now, Yaroslav's long since dead. But in 1240, Genghis Khan's grandson was carrying the Mongolian Empire west. He wanted to conquer Eastern Europe, and he did almost all of it. But his spies had told him that if he was going to get anywhere, he had to destroy Kiev, and destroy it, his forces did. In my book, I talk about the Mongolian forces and why they were so ferocious, why they were so frightening to people. But when they broke into Kiev, they killed every man, woman, child, and animal and left them to rot in the streets. The purpose was to scare the dickens out of everybody else, and it worked. Most of the rest of Kievan Rus surrendered and paid tribute. Now, before that, some of the leaders had left Kiev and headed up here to Moscow. Well, it's Muscovy then, but areas there, and eventually the leading city up in the northeast segment of what had been Kievan Rus is Moscow, that becomes the state of Russia. Okay? And I think we're staying here for a long time. Yeah, but we've got to stay. You can't understand yesterday unless you go back almost 1,000 years. What happened up here is that the people in Muscovy, what becomes Moscow, Russia, they wanted to hold on to the heritage of Kievan Rus, its status, its significance, its influence, and they were determined that they were going to protect the heritage of Kievan Rus and carry it forward. A couple things that were involved with that. Some of the leaders of what had been of the city of Kiev had recognized what was going to happen with the Mongols, and they'd already started fleeing to the northeast, and several of them ended up settling eventually in what is Moscow, so that Moscow becomes the leading center for the continuation of old Kievan Rus. And they determined that they are going to get even with the Mongols, or rather, they're going to take control again of all the territory Kievan Rus had ever had. So they're going to reestablish that in due course. Has to happen. A second thing they determined was they would continue the heritage of Byzantium, the Christian empire that was down here, which had been destroyed in 1453. So it takes a couple of centuries before this happens. It had been destroyed in 1453 by the Ottoman Turks, Muslims, Muslim forces. And part of the reason that Byzantium, Constantinople, could be destroyed is that the nations of the West, medieval Catholicism, would send no support or defense. By this time, Eastern Orthodoxy and medieval Catholicism saw themselves as enemies, or rather, each saw the other as a perversion of the faith. You don't help heretics. What ended up happening is Moscow recognized that the West, Europe, was no longer a friend, and Moscow recognized they were the only state left in the entire world that stood for orthodoxy. Because all the states that had been Orthodox in the Middle East have been overrun by the Muslims, and as well, the ones in southeastern Europe, Serbia, Bulgaria, and so on, they've been overrun as well. The only freestanding state that could defend this heritage was Eastern Orthodoxy, and they, as they understood it, stood for the one true faith. Beyond that, they saw themselves as the heirs of Byzantium as far as being a Christian empire, and by that right, they should honor God by taking control of things. And one of the things they did to make sure that was clear was they adopted the double-headed eagle symbol. You've seen that before, perhaps in pictures of old Russian Empire, or a double-headed eagle. Well, that was originally a Roman emblem that ended up being used in Byzantium as well, and then they adopted it as their own signal, as their own symbol. Beyond that, the rulers of what eventually became Russia, the state. We're moving fast through here, but eventually the title they take is TSAR or CZAR, Tsar, right? Russian for Caesar. Very deliberate. We are Caesar. One big difference. In the Byzantine Empire, the church, the Orthodox Church, was equal with the emperor and could often challenge the emperor and cause him to back down. Sometimes the emperor would force his way on the church, but they were understood to work in symphony. Okay, it was like hand in glove. The way that was the Byzantine understanding of how church and state should relate. In Moscow, there was no check. The church was supposed to do what the Tsar said. Oh, and by the way, in Byzantium and in Russia, there was no Senate, no parliament to challenge the Tsar. The Tsar was the ruler. What he said went, which made for autocracy. Over the course of centuries, we know some of these people. Ivan the Great, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Joseph Stalin. You say, Stalin was an atheist. Yeah, he'll play the game. Vladimir Putin. That kind of autocracy, that kind of self-rule, that kind of power that demands what I want, marked the way in which Russia was governed for so long. And for a long time, they could flourish with it. They eventually expanded, as I said, all the way across the continent of Asia to the Bering Sea. And they ended up expanding from where Moscow was down in this direction. Okay? Now, meanwhile, back at the ranch, okay, what had happened to the rest of Kiev and Rus? It hadn't all gone in the toilet. It hadn't all been destroyed. Some of these territories to the west, having learned the lesson from Kiev, surrendered and paid tribute to the Mongols. And then in just a handful of years, the Mongol forces headed back to Mongolia because the chief Khan had died, and all the rulers and all of the governors had to go back in order to make sure to elect the next Khan, and they didn't come back. So what happened is these smaller territories that didn't have the clout of Kiev continued as Kiev and Rus, and eventually as Poland expanded, Poland swallowed them up. So they're swallowed up into a European state that's Catholic, medieval Catholic. Now, what ended up happening, Poland was the very first state ever to have a written constitution. Beat England out. First one ever. And what ended up happening is that, to make a long story short, the people here in Western Ukraine, ruled now by Poland, the people in Western Ukraine got a whiff of what it's like to govern yourselves. They were encouraged to continue to be who they were in many regards. And eventually when the you've heard of the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian Empire, we know it better as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Eventually when Poland was defeated, the Austro-Hungarian Empire swallowed up this western part. But the rulers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the emperor, recognized that we have a lot of people in our empire who aren't Austrian. They aren't even really German. What we'll do is we'll encourage them to learn their language, to learn their history, to write their literature, even develop political parties who can elect people to serve in the Austro-Hungarian Empire's parliament. And they did, including the people to the west of what had been Kiev and Rus. These people ended up learning to read and write their language, which was not Russian. They learned to study their history and to take pride in it. They learned to organize themselves into political parties. They learned what it was like to engage in self-government. But they recognized that they were on the border between Western Europe, between Poland, which is the west, and Russia over here. They're on the borderline. They're between Catholic Poland and Orthodox Russia. And in their language, there was a term for that. Being on the border is to be on the Ukraina. They came to refer to themselves as Ukrainians. We're the ones between, on the border, between Catholic Western Europe or Western Christianity and Eastern Orthodox Russia. Eventually, Eventually, Russia ended up moving closer and closer to a variety of things. I'm just going to jump over some history here. But they ended up offering the people who were Ukrainians in this area, who had learned from their friends to the west, the people in this area asked Russia to protect them because Poland was threatening them. Poland had become a big state. And the Russian Tsar agreed to that. The Russian Tsar was willing to consider that. And so these Ukrainians, called Cossacks, you've heard of Cossacks? The phrase often goes, freedom-loving Cossacks. These guys formed militias to protect themselves against any remnants of the Mongols. And they became so powerful a force that even Poland was afraid of them. Poland, a major state, threatened them, and so they recognized they were going to need more than they just had for themselves. They asked Russia to protect them. So they happily agreed to sign that, and they said, now let's have the Tsar sign it. Oh no. The Tsar is above making agreements. The Cossacks had understood that they asked for protection. The Tsar said, no, you asked to become part of Russia. And when the Cossacks served their purposes later on, Catherine the Great had their fortresses destroyed and made them serfs. Now, along the way, an attitude that had developed, important for understanding Ukraine now, an attitude up here was that in Moscow, Russia, they were the proper descendants of Kievan Rus. They were what Kievan Rus should have been. In fact, the Rus in Kievan Rus is what Russia grows out of as a title. So they see themselves as proper Russians. They call the people back here that we know of as Ukrainians, Malorossiya, little Russians. Big Brother's going to tell you what to do, and you darn well better do it, said the Tsar. The understanding was, the expectation was, that what Russia said, Russia would get, whether by force or however. Ukrainians weren't organized in a political fighting force, and they ended up resenting it. A couple of things ended up happening in that regard are humorous, and then I'll try to wrap this up quickly and we'll turn it over. We're all still talking about history. We're now within like 120 years of where we are now. Okay, a lot of stuff has happened. Don't have time to get into all of it by any stretch of the imagination. But the Ukrainians over here had pretty much the same language as the ones over there. After all, these were people who'd been left behind after Kievan Rus had collapsed. They interacted with each other, even across borders. And what happened over here is that the people in the West, under Austria's blessing and Poland's blessing, had developed their language, had learned to read and write it, had developed their history, and so they shared it with the people over here. Only that was during the time of the Russian Empire, and the Tsar said, no, 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 no. Don't you learn that peasant language. You learn properly to speak. You learn Russian. And it was forbidden in 1866 to possess any literature written in Ukrainian. You couldn't print it. You couldn't teach it. You couldn't produce it. Well, that's over there, but this over here is still controlled by Austria. So the Ukrainians on the other side of the border said, that's okay, we'll just ship it to you. So they kept shipping it to the Ukrainians on the other side of the border, who kept reading it and learning about it. It became such an irritant to the Tsar that it became a crime in 1873 to teach it, to learn the language. Okay? In case you get the impression, Russians at that point, weren't about to let the Ukrainians go their own way because they're little brother. And Big Brother knows better. If you catch a reference to 1984, the novel by George Orwell, that may have been part of what he had in the background, in the back of his mind. In any event, this ended up happening in 1873. With the coming of communism during the First World War, the collapse of the Russian Empire, you think, oh, things are going to change. Yeah, officially it's an atheist state. Still going after Kievan Rus. Still going to present the one true non-faith to the entire world. Going to bring it. We're defending it against all this other stuff that Christians believe and whatever else. What ends up happening is that in the Second World War, finally, communist Russia now gets the rest of Ukraine. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire was divided up, after the First World War, it had gone to Poland. That area had gone to Poland, but then at the end of the Second World War, the Russians took control of all of Ukraine. And for the first time ever, they established a state called Ukraine. Oh, they're going to be free and independent. No, 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 no. That's so that the Soviet Union gets a second vote in the United Nations. Ukraine was not free. Technically, it was a separate country. It was one of the Soviet republics, but it darn well better do what Moscow intended for it to do. And so let me use the most graphic example that sticks in Ukrainians' minds more than any others of just how badly they could be treated by Russia. Now, before I go to that point, let me point out, it's not always tension. Russians and Ukrainians intermarry. They're on both sides of the border. What I'm presenting to you is specific background related to what we see happening now. Were there times when the Ukrainians and Russians got along okay? Yeah, as long as Ukrainians did what they were supposed to do, but Russians aren't always the Russian leaders weren't always gruff, and Russian people aren't at all necessarily what the Tsar was like or what the General Secretary of the Soviet Union was like. But don't cross the leader. And that's what happened in 1929. One of the things that Joseph Stalin wanted in his expansion of communism was not only to build big industries, but also which would belong to the state, to all the people, belong to no one personally. He also wanted to collectivize agriculture, to make all the farms throughout what had been the Soviet Union. He wanted to make them all state-owned. So they would collectivize them, they would belong to the state, belong to the people, but no one in particular would own anything of their own. Ukrainians, for centuries, had owned their own land. Certainly in the West, to some degree in the East. Small plots of land, but they shared in their villages. They might share an ox or something like that, or a tractor later on. But they owned, and they took great pride in it. And Stalin announced in 1929 collectivization of agriculture. And basically in Ukrainians they said, no, we're not going to go that way. By 1932, 3 years later, 3% of the Ukrainians had agreed. Stalin had enough. And he enacted some laws in 1932. Oh, by the way, in order to understand this, Ukraine, you see this territory here, was the breadbasket of the entire Russian Empire. It produced 50% of the grain foodstuffs that the entire Russian Empire relied on. Same thing, it produced 50%, just about half of all the grains that were needed in the Soviet Union. 1932, Joseph Stalin enacts laws. Every particle of grain, every grain in the harvest belongs to the state. None can be kept except what the state gives you. You cannot keep it for next year's sowing. You cannot keep it for your family. If you want to feed your family, you collectivize your farms. And he sent out commissars and soldiers to enact that. And now we can go to the slides after the maps, if we can. In 1932 to 1933, Stalin enacted these laws, that required that everything in the entirety of the grain of the harvest belonged to the state, and he sent out soldiers to make sure it was collected. And in what's called the Great Famine of 1932 to 33, in Ukrainian, the Holodomor, either first or last syllable is pronounced, 4 million Ukrainians starved to death. 1,000 every hour at one point in spring of 1933. 1 in 3 children in Ukraine starved to death. Oh, and by the way, if you are a farmer and you thought, I'll just go in and get something from my family in the city, you had to have a passport to get in the city, and guess what? Unless your farm was collectivized, you weren't allowed in. At the end of 1933, indeed, 100% of the farmland is collectivized. But 4 million people have died. And this is something the Ukrainians remember to this day, commemorate it, they don't celebrate it. But this is never far from their mind when they think about misuse. In 1991, just wrap this up now. In 1991, when the Soviet Union came to an end, Ukraine finally experienced some freedom. And for the last 30 years, they've been trying to figure out how to make their democracy work. One of the things that happened when the Soviet Union collapsed was a promise, perhaps we'll get into this later in the discussion. As the Soviet Union is collapsing, there was a promise made that NATO would not expand because the Soviet Union had understood NATO as a threat. It had set up the Warsaw Pact to counter NATO back in the height of the Cold War. But now, with the collapse of the communist bloc in 1989 and then the Soviet Union itself in 1991, Russia wanted a promise, the Russian Federation as it was then called, as it's now called still, wanted a promise that NATO would not expand, and NATO's expanded. But if I was Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Hungary, Romania, and had remembered what it was like to sit under communist rule for 40 years after the Second World War, I'd have been applying to NATO too, and they did. NATO accepted them. One of the main irritants for Vladimir Putin's Russia under his leadership is that Ukraine has been talking about and wanting to join NATO, even though there was a promise made that Ukraine would not join NATO. The other thing is that the last few years, repeatedly, when push came to shove and Moscow pushed forward its preferred candidate, Ukrainians stepped in the other direction and took it and stepped toward the West, toward Western Europe. Is there a fear on the part of Russia that Ukraine could become Western and would bring the contrast right to their doorstep? Probably. What else is going on in Putin's mind? I don't know, but let me mention a couple things then, and I'll wrap this up. We in the West, think back to Mikhail Gorbachev. Do any of you remember that name, Mikhail Gorbachev? He was the one who finally recognized we need perestroika and glasnost, openness and restructuring, because the Soviet Union wasn't working, the people's needs were not being met. They had plenty of missiles, but, and so he ended up doing some things that ended up with basically the communist bloc dismantling by 1989. In 1991, it came to an end. For us in the West, he's a hero. He's 91 years old now, still alive, one of the most hated men in all of Europe, in all of Russia. One of the most hated men in all of Russia because he weakened Russia after some years of being significant. He's hated. Vladimir Putin wants to make Russia great again. I know I've picked up on a phrase from down south. There's a reason he and the former president could get along a little bit. There was a certain kind of shared, at least general, make something great again, perception that things had fallen badly. What's he after? He certainly wants to weaken Ukraine. He certainly wants to keep it from going west. But the only way he can do that, given the path of the Ukrainians the last few years, is at the point of a gun. Because the Ukrainians have turned more and more and more toward democracy, toward government. You think, oh, there's corruption in the government. There has been, sure. And in all of the states after the First World War that were set up out of the old empires that were made to be democracies, in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and all of them, there was plenty of corruption. And within 18 years, at most, all of them became something other than democracies or republics. We're 31 years in, and Ukraine is still at it, still pushing to become a democratic government that ends up respecting the concerns of its people and is governing them. And to an autocrat like Vladimir Putin, to have that on your doorstep is frightening. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll turn it over to what's going to happen next. I should have mentioned that. the slide. This is a slide in a memorial park just outside Kiev. I forgot to point it out. A little girl holding some grains of wheat. That was a capital crime in 1933.
Jim, thank you very much for sharing that romp through history. It really does help set the frame to see how the roots of what we're seeing today go back 1,000 years. It's staggering. We are going to shift now to an open time of discussion. And yeah, if you want to take your chair, and Bob, if you want to take the chair there, I'll introduce you. Matt, can I get you to hand your dad the microphone that's back by the font? You can take it off the stand and just hand it to him. That's probably easiest. We're honored to have a second guest tonight, and I'm going to introduce him in a moment. And after I introduce him, you're going to have an opportunity to ask questions, if you want, of either of our panelists or of Mr. Tidridge, or even of myself, if I can respond to anything. You can, there will be a mic in the center in a moment. You can just express your thoughts. If you just have a thought that you want to say, you can do that. If you have a feeling on your heart that you just want to get out, this is a safe place to say what is on your mind, to say what is on your heart. And we won't be responding to each other, but the panelists can respond to you if you have any questions. And Mr. Tidridge will be on the other microphone to assist me as we moderate the room. And Matt has the roving microphone, so if you want to say anything, ask a question or anything, if you want to come to the center aisle in a moment, then he'll have the microphone for you. Also, those of you who are joining us online, and we do have several people on the live feed tonight, if you have questions for any of our panelists or want to say anything, if there's something on your heart, put it in the chat on the live feed on YouTube, and I will be monitoring the chat right here, so I can share your questions with the room if you have anything. I'm going to introduce you through your son first, if that's okay. One of my best friends since grade 11 is Matt Dodlin. And when I wrapped up my first year of seminary out in Vancouver, those of you who know me know I'm an avid motorcyclist. Well, back then my only mode of transportation was motorcycle, because I was a broke university student. And I was coming back from Vancouver, where I was in school, back to Southern Ontario that summer. And Matt called me up and he said, you know, we can't have you ride all the way from Vancouver to Southern Ontario by yourself now, can we? And I said, absolutely not. What do you have in mind? And he said, well, I thought I would have to ride out and meet you and ride back with you. I said, that sounds like a great idea, but we can't have you just ride all the way out here by yourself just to turn around and ride all the way back again with me. Now, can we? And he said, absolutely not. What did you have in mind? And I said, we're going from Vancouver to Southern Ontario. I think San Francisco's on the way home. So he rode out, spent a few days with me in Vancouver, and the two of us hopped on our motorcycles after my last exam, and we rode all the way down the west coast of the United States to San Francisco, camped on the beach in Eureka, California, had some other adventures that I won't share publicly, and rode all the way back to Southern Ontario. And a couple of years later, Matt took a run for the Liberal Party, following in his father's footsteps, and invited me to be a part of his team for that election. And we got to be mentored by an expert politician. So it's my privilege to welcome our second panelist now, the Honorable Justice Robert Dodlin, retired, former Liberal Member of Parliament for Chatham-Kent under Pierre Trudeau. That tells you how long ago he was a Member of Parliament. Former Parliamentary Secretary to the Secretary of State for Canada, former Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasury Board, former Parliamentary Representative to the United Nations, and you just heard the significance of the 1991 Ukrainian election, the first free and democratic election. Am I correct in phrasing it that way? The first free and democratic election in Ukraine. Justice Dodlin was one of the official Canadian international election observers for that election in Ukraine. So my pleasure to welcome you tonight, Bob. And before we get to the open questions, you had a couple of stories of what it was like being in Ukraine for that first free election, and I invite you to take the floor and share those stories if you would. Yeah.
Thank you for those glowing words. I tell you, it's a challenge to follow someone like the professor. But let me tell you that when the OECD, I think it's the Organization for Cooperation and Development in Europe, asked for volunteers to attend the democratic election in Ukraine, I volunteered and was lucky enough to be chosen and to go. I flew into Kiev, and there it was decided that I and a Russian representative, the two of us would be partners, would go to Lviv in the west, and that we would do our monitoring there. A couple of things really impressed me when I arrived there. We traveled by train overnight. Getting there, we were taken to the main office of the directors who were looking after the election. And I noticed that it was an incredibly rural area. Once we left the city, there were no paved roads to be seen, none. And it was the latter part of March, and it had been raining, and there was mud up to your knees. I mean, it was just incredible, and it was a muck sort of mud. And the day of the election, I still remember this, I started hearing noise outside the hotel that they had housed us in, and there were people at 3 o'clock in the morning slogging through the mud on their way to the electoral sites in order to cast their vote. And I tell you, it would have taken an army to stop those people from getting there. They were so involved and so anxious and so delighted that they were going to be asked to express themselves by vote. So that was impressive. I thought to myself, my goodness, I wish people back in Canada could see this and the devotion to democracy that, in fact, these people were showing. The other thing that impressed me was the election day. We had picked, I think it was 4 polls that we were going to go to see how the preparations for opening the polls were going to go. We walked in, the first poll, and all of the electoral officers were standing by the paperwork, which they left there untouched until they all stood, put their hands on their hearts, and sang the Ukrainian anthem. No music, just viva voce, and it was some kind of impressive. A couple other little things that I'll say, and then I'll sit down. One of the polls that we attended was a lumber factory, there was a huge main stairway that went up 3 floors. The voting poll was on the 3rd floor, no elevator. I thought, boy, that's really not making it very easy for voters. And I saw elderly people, 70, 80, maybe even in the 90s, traversing those stairs, going up, arriving breathless, and looking to see where they would go. 2 ladies came in, arm in arm. Both of them I judged to be in excess of 75. They went to the poll clerk, registered, and then they went immediately to the booth, and both of them entered at the same time. Well, I got to tell you that my Ukrainian partner, or at least my Russian partner, went berserk. I mean, this could not be allowed. He went to the poll clerk and said, "You must stop this. It can't be allowed." And finally, the poll clerk sort of said, "Well, okay, fine, I'll do what I can do." And he went over to the poll, pulled aside the curtain, explained to the women why he was there. And one of the women said, "Okay," shook her head, and came back out, leaving the other woman in the polling station. A few minutes later, the curtain moved aside, and the lady inside said something to the lady now standing outside, who shook her head in the affirmative, reached into her purse, and took out the only pair of glasses that the 2 of them had, and gave the poll clerk the glasses so that the woman inside could vote. One final little anecdote I'll give you, and then I'll sit down. One of the other polls that we attended during the day to see how it was going saw a woman, again, I don't know why they chose these buildings the way they did, but again, I think it was 2 stories high in order to get to the polling station. A woman showed up, great with child, I mean huge with child, walked up those stairs, went in, voted, and to the ladies of the room, you'll understand this, to the men, it sure surprised me. She came out of the polling station, let out a little cry, plunked herself down on the floor, and had the child. That's devotion to democracy. Wow. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, those are some powerful stories. We who have grown up in a democratic society can take democracy and the right and privilege of voting so for granted. And to hear stories like that of people who have not had that opportunity their entire lives and being given that opportunity for the first time ever, and how important it was to them, is a helpful reminder for how important it should be for us. Nathan, if you want to take the other microphone over there, and we'll open the floor now, and reminder those of you who are online, if you want to pop a comment or question in the chat, I'll be able to see it from here and I'll share it with the room. And any of you who are here in the room, if you have a question for either of our panelists or hosts, you may feel free to come to the center microphone in the center aisle. If you have a question, a comment, a thought, a feeling, anything you want, you are free to express what you wish. Yeah.
I'm just interested to know about the famine.
You can hold the microphone closer to your mouth, please. Thanks.
When the farmers weren't allowed to keep any of their own wheat, did they stop farming? Is that why there was the famine?
Did they try to stop what?
Did the farmers stop farming if they weren't allowed to keep their own stuff?
One of the things I found twice when I was in Ukraine is that people work because they're supposed to work. And you might hope that the government would relax it. You don't know from these farmers who ended up dying, but they kept working at the fields. They kept gathering the harvest. And they tried to hide things in the floorboards of their places where they lived, or perhaps find a place in a field where they could hide it, because the commissars and soldiers couldn't be everywhere. And so they would hold on to some and try to, but there's stories of little girls like the one in the picture starting to eat something and the commissar coming and making them empty their hands. So it was brutal, and it was brutal enough that by the end the Ukrainian farmers just, who still survived, said, all right, collectivize it. The other example I saw of it was when I was there in 1999. I was taken to see some of the work they were doing in a cancer research area, and some very sophisticated stuff. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but being shown what they were trying to do, the kind of medicines they were working on, the kind of practices they were using to try to treat cancer. And then somebody who knew the situation better than I said, oh, and by the way, Jim, they haven't been paid in 3 months. They still keep coming to work because, well, they want to serve their people. So there's something that's been ingrained in them, enough of them that even through some extraordinary hardships, they keep going.
Thank you. Just feel free to come to the center, and Matt's got the microphone for you if you have a question or a comment.
I guess just a follow up on the famine. Of the 4 million people that died, what was the population of Ukraine at the time? So, and then what happened to productivity in agriculture after the collectivization?
I don't know what the population was at the time. For sure, Ukraine is the largest landmass country that's just in Europe, larger than France. Just a couple of years ago, it had 44 million people. It's had as much in the times I've known it, as 49 million. It would have been fewer. So let's say it was 40 million, so it'd be roughly 10% of the population. Now, of course, there were people living in cities who were working in factories, so they're doing the Stalinist thing, and they were getting food. They would try to ship food out to family and relatives in the farms, but unless the farm was collectivized, it could not be delivered. And I'd add to 28 countries have acknowledged this Holodomor as a genocide, Canada one of them.
Hi, there's been some news articles and a bit of controversy about the red and black flag and what that means. Can you just explain that?
The which flag?
The red and black.
I think it's related to an ultra-right-wing group within Ukraine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. Thank you. Let me do the Ukrainian flag first, and I'll get to that one. The Ukrainian flag, if you've seen it, is blue and yellow. Blue for the clear sky because it's primarily a flatland country, and yellow for the green. So it's a very simple flag, but you'll recognize that. The red and black one, there were a group of vigorous nationalists during the Second World War who fought against the Russians, and they were called Nazis, and they were certainly hardline right-wingers. Segments of that have continued in a certain area of Ukraine. I just heard about it. I don't know where in Ukraine it is, but you've heard perhaps Vladimir Putin talking about wanting to denazify Ukraine. A couple of things about that. That's a dog whistle. We have extreme right-wing groups in Canada. We have them in the States. I was in Idaho. There's some really extreme right-wing stuff going on out there. So it's not a surprise if you have it. But what happened during the Second World War is that when the Nazis invaded the territory that was controlled by the Russians, the Ukrainians welcomed them. They knew what it was like. It was only 6 years after the Holodomor. They welcomed the Nazis. They didn't know what the Nazis would do. They knew what the communists had done. And when the communists drove the Nazis back out in 1944 and 1945, a lot of the Ukrainian nationalists fought against the communists, not because they were Nazis, but because they didn't want communist Russia to take over again. But in the Russian press, we're fighting the Nazis. Some are German, some are Ukrainian. And that's served Vladimir Putin as a dog whistle to rally the people in Russia to be fearful of what happened, what could go on in Ukraine, because supposedly it's being run by Nazis. A Jewish person is president of Nazis, right? Think about that. But they try to pass that one off. Zelensky is a Jewish fellow, and his, that sort of thing. But the idea of using this as a way of gathering people to be angry, because in the Second World War, the Russians did all the fighting from the east to drive the Nazis back into Germany and out of Eastern Europe. And the Russians lost 22 million people, died. And they don't call it the Second World War, they call it the Great Patriotic War. So then to talk about Nazis in Ukraine that want to keep them, that are hurting people who are genuine Slavs, that serves to rally the troops. And the red and black flag is, thank you, the red and black flag has been used by that group and other groups to indicate opposition to Russia. Thank you.
I'm actually going to throw to Mr. Tidridge while we're waiting for the next person to come to the microphone, because you picked up on two words there that I think would be helpful to unpack. Nathan, can I put you on the spot on the issue of what's the difference between nationalism and patriotism? Because both of those words came up in that answer. Can I put you on the spot for that?
Sure.
Yeah.
In civics, we would say that nationalism, well, it's a fine line, actually. We would use the Olympics as an example of love of country and patriotism, of celebrating your country and rallying around its symbols. Where we cross into nationalism is when we start centering our country over others and saying that our country is better than others and rallying around those symbols as a way to put down other countries and see us as better than. And so it's kind of a fine line, actually. That's the way we would explain it at the high school. And that if it goes too far, we can get into very dangerous territory. Since I'm up, can I ask a question?
Of course you can.
In just picking up on Zelensky, I'm fascinated by him, and students are fascinated by him as well. And since I have a man of the political and governmental world and a man of the history and academic world, what do we do? Zelensky we're watching him transform. He's become a symbol. I heard a Ukrainian newscaster explain him that he's no longer the president of Ukraine, he's the leader of Ukraine, which is interesting because I think it was just last year, he was actually not doing well as a politician. I think he was elected in at 73% support. Now he was in the 20s, and then this happened, and it's just totally transformed him. What is going to happen with Volodymyr Zelensky? Because he's definitely a threat to Vladimir Putin. What do you think is going to happen to somebody like him? And is there a historical equivalent to him? When we think of historical figure, I've heard people relate him to Churchill. I don't know if that's a very good, connection, but a good comparison. But anyway, I just thought to get both of your opinion on what you think of Zelensky.
Do you have anything to say?
Bob, you want to take a shot at that first? Open your crystal ball and predict Zelensky's future?
Well, I guess I would have to say that Zelensky is certainly no friend of Putin's, and that Putin probably regards him as an enemy. I would really be surprised if Zelensky survives the takeover of Ukraine by Russia. I think that they recognize, Putin recognizes, and I shouldn't say they. I think the term autocracy really applies here. That there's one power in Russia right now, and it's Putin. And when you saw the when you saw the public demonstration of that, when Putin is sitting at the end of that long table and all of his quote-unquote cabinet, I suppose, or advisors have to speak from a script, and if one of them strays from the script, he's scolded by Putin. I think that, in my mind, that demonstrates that, in fact, Zelensky's time would be very, very limited if Ukraine falls. Now, this is perhaps a wrong time to inject this, but I've tried to think over and over again, not having the historic background that the professor has given to us. Why would Russia, as a country, be so concerned about Ukraine? And the only Western world equivalent that I can come up with, quite frankly, is during President Kennedy's time, when Russia proposed to bring missiles into Cuba. And the way the United States reacted to having missiles on their doorstep all of a sudden sharpened my thinking a little bit, and I thought, Russia, regardless of its size, would not want to have Ukraine sitting there as a member of NATO, or even independently, having those kinds of armament on their border. So it allowed me, I guess, to maybe see a little bit of the other side of the reasoning. I don't know whether that's valid or not, but there we are.
Yeah. I saw an interesting observation made by somebody who's tried to keep up with this morning, and it caught me off guard. But he said he doesn't think it impossible that if Putin were able to take control of Ukraine and seize the government, that Zelensky would be kept on as a figurehead but with no power, with a prime minister taking orders from Putin. And that hadn't even occurred to me as a possibility. But that might be one way to keep from irritating the rest of the world so badly, as Zelensky has become, a symbol to the rest of the world of bravery and the fighting spirit of the Ukrainians. That caught me entirely off guard, and I don't know that Putin is that clever. He's certainly mean, but I don't know if he's that clever.
Zelensky certainly has been inspiring. I can't picture him being willing to be a puppet.
No.
No. I see somebody else moving to the center.
Yes. First of all, I'd just like to clarify about the red and black flag. That was a flag for the Ukrainian insurgent army during World War II. Yes, they did join the Nazis, but that's because the Nazis had promised them a free Ukraine. However, shortly after, they lied. So what happened? They actually fought both the Russians, the Soviets, and the Germans in the end for their freedom. And this flag now, today, represents independence. Fight for independence. That's what the flag represents.
Great.
Now, I just want to add a couple more things, I think, that helps us understand what is happening in Ukraine today. If you go back 8 years, 2014, there was a revolution in Ukraine, the bloodless revolution, the Orange Revolution, which actually, I think, started part of those the spring revolutions. And what happened was they overthrew their prime minister, or president, sorry, who was in colludes with Russia. And in so doing, he got thrown out and he got thrown away. Now, just as soon as that happened, Putin walked in and took over Crimea. And then, to make his route a little better, they started a war in the two colonies Donetsk and Luhansk, which the Russian parliament just recently said are independent states. And this is where Putin originally said he was going to basically protect his people that are there. Interesting to also, from what I've heard, Odessa, which is the main port, which is being bombed, apparently, or will be, is mostly Russian-speaking people. And I was watching the television, and a lady interviewed was saying that the mayor, who had a lot of Russian, saying, you know, there's no way Putin's coming here to protect the Russians. Now, Ukraine over the last 8 years started to become democratic, because before there was a lot of corruption and other things in the government, and the government was starting to become democratic. Democracy was beginning to work. And of course, Putin, being an authoritarian, doesn't want democracy. And the people of Ukraine, they want to go to Europe. They want to become part of the European Union. They've been under Russia for too long, and they want to get out of there. So they want their independence. They want to move over and be part of Europe as opposed to part of Russia.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts.
If I may,
Yeah, please.
I should say that when I was there, when I traveled to the west of Ukraine, it was clear that they felt much closer to Europe than to Russia. The eastern part of Ukraine, however, when I sat and spoke with those who in fact had gone and done the observing in the east, they said it was like being part of Russia. The common language of the people was Russian, it wasn't Ukrainian. And I recalled at that point, as I traveled with my Ukrainian, or at least my Russian partner, in the observation role, he insisted when we went into any poll that they speak to him in Russian. He demanded it, that they speak Russian. And interesting, they all could. Wow. But in the west, where we were, in the western part of Ukraine, they had to be almost forced to speak Russian. They wanted to speak Ukrainian.
If I can add just a couple more things I've learned recently about this as well. Those two regions that were seized in 2014 or supposedly were liberated by whatever, Luhansk and Donetsk, are predominantly Russian-speaking. There were people that were brought there probably from Russia to work in the newly established factories. But it was within the Soviet Union. You know, the borders didn't matter a whole lot. You know, whatever. And so they would speak Russian. But throughout at least central Ukraine, you can speak either language. You're not repressed if you speak Russian in Kiev. In fact, Zelensky had to learn to speak Ukrainian because he grew up in one of those two provinces. In 2014, according to a poll that was done, one in Donetsk, one in Luhansk, the people saw what was happening in the Maidan, and in one of those territories, 74%, and the other one, 76%, said they preferred to live in Ukraine because of what was happening politically, not in Russia, even though they're Russian-speaking. Putin has been saying that these people who are in these two provinces, who are unquestionably predominantly Russian-speaking, are being oppressed. By whom? There's no evidence whatsoever that Russian speakers are given any hard time and have ever been given a hard time in that region by independent Ukraine. But it serves as, again, a way to look at these awful people, what they're doing to our people. We got to protect Luhansk and Donetsk, and now they're going to try to sever them and make them part of Russia at the very least. Yeah.
So would it be fair to characterize that as a manufactured conflict in those regions?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've heard people suggest parallels, just for either of you, to I'm sorry, the name of the former territory escapes me, but in the former Eastern Yugoslavia, in the lead up to World War II, Hitler did a similar thing. Is there a fair comparison, do you think, between Hitler's actions in manufacturing conflict and Putin's actions in manufacturing conflict here?
I have to think which one it was.
Matt, you remember it?
Yes,
Okay, we'll come back to it.
I have a question. There's nothing has been said tonight about the oligarchs, the role of the oligarchs around Vladimir Putin. Is there a possibility of some kind of a coup? Because when you deprive a person who's a billionaire of making money, it's getting to be a bit of a length of time now with all these sanctions. Is that not going to put the push on Putin to give these guys a break, or else they're going to try to get them out? Maybe a coup or something? Would that be conceivable?
Realistic chance of a coup? Either of you want to take a stab at this or decline?
I can do a little bit of it. On Steve Payton the other night, Bill Browder was interviewed, and he was asked about the relationship of the oligarchs to Putin. And a few years back, there was one of the oligarchs, and these oligarchs had gotten rich by taking advantage of the properties of the state that suddenly became available. They bought them. They were able to make the money out of what had supposedly belonged to the communist state. That happened in many places of Eastern Europe, where the people got rich by having using their connections suddenly to take control of these industries. And then they could use that money in other ways. There was an oligarch, and this is Bill Browder on Steve Payton again, last week. There was an oligarch that crossed Putin in some way. What it was, I didn't hear, but he was brought forward in a trial, found guilty, and sentenced to forever in prison. And the other oligarchs came. These are all multimillionaires, if not billionaires, came to Putin and said, what do we have to do to avoid this, avoid a similar fate? Because they knew this guy hadn't done anything like what he was accused of. He said 50%. Not 50% of their wealth to the government, 50% of their wealth to Putin. He is fabulously wealthy by anybody's standards. The oligarchs are all scared. Probably the only hope is that some of them would band together and form some kind of coup. There is nobody, as far as I've been able to see, who's kind of like the next person who's going to be the leader after Putin. There's nobody who's kind of standing in the wings to take his place. So perhaps a coup would be the only way forward.
What maybe would add a bit of fire to that, fuel to the fire there would be, I've been hearing on the news and media lately that some of the Russian soldiers are very reluctant about this war. They're not, their hearts are not in it.
Yeah. Zelensky has referred to them as confused children. Several of them did, there were some interviews with some who'd been captured. And one of the guys who was captured, a Russian soldier, young man, they were supposedly out for the military weekends, training. And he says, as we're going in, he says, we're following commander's orders, whatever else. He asked somebody who was higher up than he was, why are we seeing so many Ukrainian license plates? He said, shut up, keep driving. Didn't know they were going in Ukraine.
Bob, you want to take a stab at that one or pass on that one? I'm sorry? Did you want to take a stab on the oligarch overthrow? Potential?
I don't know that I have enough information in terms of the organization of the oligarchs. I don't detect from here that they are well organized at all. I mean, independently, they're fabulously wealthy, and they clearly, I suppose, being human, are going to want to try to protect that wealth. And I suppose, given that there's no obvious successor, or even a person who, in fact, is prepared to take on Putin, except those who, in fact, have spoken publicly and ended up in prison. So that they don't have a leader, I guess I would say at this point, who might cause some kind of revolution.
Nobody to rally around, yeah. Nathan, can I throw to you again for a second before we go back to the main floor for a little civics lesson? We're using some big words here, and I don't want to assume that everybody knows what they mean. Would you can I put you on the spot to explain what oligarchy is as contrasted to rich people?
Well, oligarchy is rich people,
yeah.
But it's rich people, I think, with political power. It's a term that's usually, from my understanding, applied to Russian history. And it's like the professor said, it was when essentially the communist state was converted into capitalism. If you had the right connections, and there was a local factory that had recently been owned by the state, and suddenly it got flipped to you to buy for a nominal fee, and then all of a sudden you became fabulously wealthy. So I think that's my understanding, and that's what I would teach, is that it's very, very wealthy people who are very, very well connected, but in and of themselves, I think within Russia, if I'm understanding correctly, don't have the mechanisms of power. They don't have access to the military or anything like that, and that's what sets them apart from someone like Vladimir Putin. They have money, but that's all they have. They don't have those connections that they used to have. I think when Russia was formed, I think they had a little bit more connections, and I think Putin has pretty much crushed all of that.
Was there somebody else in the center there? Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, the question is for Professor Payton, and that is on the small languages. As you know, European Union has a league of minority languages. Catalan is one, Breton, all those languages. And there are some regulations in the European Union as how the national government has to treat those smaller languages. Now, what I have read already a couple of years is that Russian groups in the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and so on, have petitioned that league and also the European Union because in the changeover of the disappearance of the USSR, there has been now all of a sudden the Russian groups who were often part of the leadership in those smaller countries, because they were brought in as good-paying jobs in industry, and you alluded to that already in the eastern states. Yet it continues. They now have the states like Estland and so put a lot of effort in stimulating their own language. And that had, in certain groups of the Russians, quite a bit of bad blood. And as such, it was already years identified as, in the press anyway, that is a weak heel of those countries, where, like in the Crimea, Russia could ferment certain loyalties under the Russian people. In the Russian minority who could act as a 5th Brigade or whatever. What is your opinion about that?
I didn't know about that provision with regard to the minority languages. I'm not surprised, but I'm disappointed that the freer states, if they're giving Russian speakers a hard time, but had a humorous counter to that a few years ago. As I was getting into Eastern European studies, I thought, I want to be able to read in the original languages. What's the biggest language of all that has the most literature? Russian. I figured, well, Russian with its connections to Serbian and Bulgarian and to a degree to Ukrainian, whatever else. If I learned Russian, then I'd be able to branch out and learn. That's what I'd done with other language. I used to teach German, so I taught myself to read Dutch, and I can kind of make my way through Danish a little bit. So I thought I can kind of do that if I really learn Russian well. But then the person I was studying Russian with was an elderly lady, and she passed away. And so I talked to a young woman who was in the field of study I was pursuing. She was from Croatia. And I mentioned to her, I said, Andrea, she says, I said, I was learning Russian, but, I said, now I can't learn it anymore. My teacher is dead. But I thought I could end up being able to speak it throughout Europe, Eastern Europe, because all of you people will have learned Russian. And she looked at me and said, Jim, not one of us will admit to speaking Russian anymore. They were free. But she said, you wouldn't get anywhere speaking Russian. So there was real hostility in that regard. It's regrettable if that's what, the average Russian is facing if he's living in Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania or whatever. That's sad.
Thank you.
I just had really curious. Although Ukraine is not part of NATO, and I was thinking of this myself, is there anything NATO could have done or could do to have prevent this from happening in the first place with Putin?
Bob, what do you think? You want to take a stab at that? Is there anything that NATO could have done proactively ahead of this to have maybe lessened the chance of it getting to this point?
I guess my reaction to that would be highly unlikely that there was anything that in fact could have been done preemptively by NATO. They would have been prohibited or prevented or precluded from doing those things in the same manner as they are now. They're there and they're standing ready to protect members of NATO. But they're deathly afraid that any action taken by them will be interpreted as an aggravation and an enlargement of the conflict, and give Putin the right then to expand the arms, the war against them. I've reflected on that a bit, trying to think, God, there must be something that could be done. And I reflected a bit on the Second World War and the fact that the Americans, that the United States, for a long time refused to become involved. I mean, they were isolationists. If the Europeans want to fight, let them go ahead, but we're not going to get involved. But yet, when Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin got together, the Americans, I don't know who came up with the idea, but the Lend-Lease program permitted the Americans to all of a sudden start producing aircraft, ships, and what have you. And it occurred to me that the same thing could be done now. The fear, and I think that's what it is the fear by the United States and the Western world is that Putin will use that as an excuse to enlarge the war. And my son at one point said, what you're saying is that this is a huge game of chicken, and that Putin is threatening the rest of the world with armed conflict if they don't allow him to do what he wants to do. But at the end of the day, there has to be a point beyond which the West will not permit Putin to go. I don't know that we've reached that yet, and my hope is that those people in power in the West are not saying, you know what, we can let them have Croatia, we can let them have the two states on the east. Indeed, we can sacrifice Ukraine so long as we can stop and hold them there. But if in fact it's Putin's desire to create a new Soviet Union and to enlarge the Russian influence to what the old USSR used to be, and beyond that, if he can go that far, why does he need to stop there? Why can't he go beyond? It looks like 1939 again, and the people in the West saying, oh, well, we can negotiate with this fellow, okay? We can give them a little bit and keep ourselves safe. And I wonder whether we've failed to remember or to learn the lessons of '39 and the Second World War.
Peace in our time. Just follow up to that. At the risk of asking the obvious from what you just said, so do you feel the risk of escalation here is real and severe? And second to that, do you think that our government, and I'm asking you to speculate, so feel free to decline, do you think that our government has a line in the sand in the backs of our collective governmental lines that if that line is crossed, we will step into action? Do you think the risk is real for escalation, and do you think there's a line that would tip us over into doing more than we're doing?
I think there's real vacillation taking place, and I don't know that individually any of the Western countries have in their mind a real line beyond which they're not prepared to see Putin go. And that scares me. And it may be that it shows a lack of leadership in the Western world. I mean, if we had another person like Churchill or Roosevelt who said, boys and girls, this has to be the line, and was able to convince the rest of the nations that, or the majority of them, that line should be drawn and observed, then maybe that would work. But right now, I don't detect that kind of leadership, nor do I see individual countries demonstrating that in their minds there is a line. Not yet.
Yeah. I agree that it looks like NATO and the West are willing to make Ukraine a sacrificial lamb to protect ourselves. I heard a military analyst say it's one thing if Putin can take over the country and perhaps topple the government, but with 140,000 or even 180,000 soldiers, you can't control a populace of 40 million. And he says that the street warfare, the guerrilla warfare, the kind of things that happened in the Second World War are just going to become endemic. If Ukrainians have had 30 years of freedom. The reason they're fighting like lions is they remember what happened to their forebears. And I think, interestingly, the greatest amount of pressure is likely in these regards going to be placed on our government because we have the highest number of Ukrainian heritage people in all the world outside Russia and Ukraine, 1.3 million Ukrainian Canadians. So if any government is going to face kind of collective pressure from within their own country to draw a line in the sand, Canada will be asked for it, but we don't have the kind of military thump and power to be able to pull that off. So there'd have to be kind of a collective will. And what I see at this point is, please don't go any further. Please don't bring this up to nuclear war. Please just take Ukraine.
Of course, one of those people of whom you speak is our Deputy Prime Minister.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We got time for maybe one or two more questions or comments from the floor. There's a hand over here, Matt, if you want.
Why do you think Putin has chosen this time for his invasion?
Why now? Is that what you're asking?
Now?
Why now? Any thoughts, either of you?
Is it the weakness of Biden?
No, I think he would have been smarter to do it under Trump because Trump had already divided NATO pretty well.
I don't think he would go under Trump.
Yeah. So of all things, NATO seems to have more resolve right now than they had a couple of years ago when President Trump was making things difficult, for the alliance. I think the other thing is several military analysts, at least the ones that I've seen in the news, whatever else, indicate that Putin didn't plan this out very well. They're running out of fuel. Some of the soldiers are eating rations best before 2015 from people who can read the Russian on the side of the cans, and I'm thinking, oh, geez. And running out of fuel. Many of the people who have been captured were teachers on weekend military training, they thought. And so there's a lot of misinformation being generated to the Russian people. A law was passed 10 days ago, I think, or something. It is now a crime to have and spread any information anywhere in Europe from anything else except official government sources. So to get information from Facebook or from the news or internet or something is a problem. It certainly doesn't seem to be going as well as he planned, and so a number of people have suggested that he didn't plan it all that well. He just decided to.
So to borrow from a literary expression, are you suggesting the emperor has no clothes?
I'm not sure about that.
Is there a hollowness to this?
Is there a what?
A hollowness to this military action? Like, is there a weakness beneath the surface? The lack of fuel, the lack of food.
It certainly, from what I've been reading, and admittedly these are sources sympathetic to Ukrainians.
Yeah.
But the Russian military isn't acting nearly as powerful as it did many years ago. It isn't acting with as much thrust and potency, and doesn't seem to be as well governed or well led as it did in the past. So the other thing is that he probably didn't expect the kind of resistance that he's getting.
Yeah.
Putin actually believes his own stories about the denazification and the Russians are being mistreated or something.
Yeah.
The politicians in Ukraine, some say...
Can you use the microphone, please?
Pardon?
You need to hold the microphone to your mouth. Yeah. Closer.
The politicians in the Ukraine, some say that they're the most corrupt in the world. And as leader of the Ukraine, Zelensky, do you think he is part of the corruption or trying to stop it?
I don't know about how you compare corruption across the world. I mean, just because there's so many different ways in which it manifests itself. Has there been corruption in Ukraine? Yeah. Has there been corruption in any government as it stumbles its way toward democracy? Yep. Is Zelensky trying to overcome it? That's the impression I had, but I don't have any data on what's actually being done. Yeah. One of the things that they tried to do in these two revolutions that were mentioned, the Rose Revolution and the Maidan Revolution, was to challenge corruption from Ukrainian types of oligarchs who had more direct access to the leaders, the presidents or prime ministers, whatever they're called in Ukraine. That was addressed, but how successful that's been, I don't know.
Yeah. Thank you. No, we'll move on. You've had two. Thanks. Yeah.
This is another look in the crystal ball kind of question. How can Putin get out and save face being that sort of strong, terrible leader that Russians look up to, and yet not appearing weak to the European community, gaining something out of this mess because blood has flown, or flowed rather, from his troops? How can he have a graceful exit that's not debasing to him, do you think?
If I could try that, I suspect that what he has to do, he has to come up with something that he can interpret. The Western world may not, NATO may not, but if he can interpret it as a win, then he can get out of it saving face. One of the things I think that would work for him is if, in fact, Zelensky and the government in Ukraine, recognizing that there's a certain inevitability to what seems to be happening, decided that, in fact, they would provide Putin with some kind of assurance that they are not going to seek membership in NATO, that membership in the European Union is adequate for them, okay? And then maybe icing on the cake, and give them an undertaking that, in fact, there will be no retaliation and no effort on the part of Ukraine to recover all or part of the land that, in fact, has been occupied in the east. Putin could then see that as an absolute win. And if he can then turn to his people and say, see, this is what I've achieved, and we have to be humane, so I think I will instruct my army to leave. The interesting thing that he's got going against him is guerrilla warfare has always made organized warfare very, very difficult. When the people who know the country, know the weaknesses that the country creates for an incoming force, they can make it extremely difficult for the force moving in. I'm also told that what we're seeing is a lapse of memory on the part of Putin, and maybe not listening to his military advisors. We're seeing the same sort of thing happening to the Russian forces that happened to the Nazi forces in the Second World War. Those mud roads that I saw when I was in Ukraine, they're still there. And if you leave the roads, the mud is worse. So you're almost committed to leaving your heavy equipment, tanks, trucks, fuel, what have you. They have to be left on the roadway. And so they're static targets. And so the guerrillas can just pick them off, you know, pick off some in the back of the line and some in the front of the line. The rest are trapped, and at will you can start destroying them. And apparently the Nazis suffered from that during the First World War, and it looks to me like the most likely thing that's happened is that Putin is a leader of one and is not prepared to listen to advisors. He advises the advisors. And if somebody in the military told him, hey, number one, this is a stupid idea for us to be moving into Ukraine at this time of year. Do you know what those roads are like? Do you know what off the road is even worse? And if he doesn't believe that and felt that the time was right and we're going to do it now, he may really have committed the problem that we're seeing created for him now.
Put it in a humorous light, have you seen the videos of two tractors with towing capacities carrying off Russian tanks while the soldiers were away looking for diesel fuel? There was one where this gypsy fellow, Roma, had a tractor with towing capacities. He backed up to this tank while the Russian soldiers were out looking for diesel, and he took off with it, and it took a while to build up some speed, but the Russian soldiers were chasing after him, and they couldn't catch him. That happened at least twice now in Ukraine on the site. Now that's funny, you know, you see the picture, you think of Keystone Cops kinds of things. But yeah, you don't want to go off in the mud and as you said, sitting ducks. It's dangerous.
That's the power of guerrilla warfare. Yeah. To just try and nail down the question a little tighter, trying to understand the mindset of a diplomat. Are you suggesting that a diplomat in a situation like this would be looking to Putin to identify his own gracious way out and then seizing upon that when that's named? Would that be the likely strategy?
I don't know that Putin is prepared to do that. I think that for him to identify a strategy like that would be viewed by him, I think, as a sign of weakness and a fear that people around him would see that as weakness. Yeah. Maybe, just maybe, when one takes a look at the faces of those people who were being forced to read these scripts at the meeting with Putin, the advisors, so-called, maybe if they see things going sufficiently badly, when they start hearing from the Russian mothers who are saying, why is my son dead? Okay, and they're hearing that over and over and over again, they may feel the pressure before Putin does, and some of them might start developing backbone to say to him, we've got a problem and we've got to resolve it ourselves here.
I just want to check with you, Kyle, because there's a lag on my feed from the internet map. If you can take one step to the side so I guide eye contact with Kyle. Kyle, can you see the live feed? Is there anything coming up there in terms of questions in the chat? Are you able to monitor that from where you are? No? Okay. I wasn't sure because I wasn't seeing anything here, but my feed is about 3 minutes behind live. We got time for one more, and then we'll wrap. Somebody who hasn't spoken yet, yeah.
So I was just wondering, I guess, to continue the theme of the crystal ball, typically there is a peacekeeping force that will come in.
Can you hold the microphone closer?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thanks.
So first of all,
maybe if you slip the mask down.
Sure, I can try that. Given the lead up and the memory, as you said, not only in Ukraine but other Eastern European countries of Russia. So first of all, if there is a negotiated settlement, there won't be the trust. We would need maybe a peacekeeping force or something, but who in the world would be the peacekeeping force? It certainly couldn't be the West. Like, who would be the external force that would help to A, moderate that, and then B, enforce it?
They're asking big questions, aren't they?
Yeah. Who would be trusted by both sides? The only group that I can see Putin trusting would be Belarusians, and nobody in the West is going to trust them, and nobody from the former Eastern European countries that were ruled by the communist regimes would be trusted by Russia. They're members of NATO now. I don't know. Maybe they could get Chinese people to do it if they were accepted on both sides. But what do they know about Europe? In that regard, as far as being on the ground. Yeah, good. Any ideas?
Thoughts, Bob?
I would have thought 2 weeks ago that potentially China could have been an intermediary.
Yeah.
But it's clear that Putin has made approaches to China that they seem to be responding to.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to, it would have taken a real exercise of will for Western nations, I think, to accept China as a legitimate intermediary before that juncture between Putin and the current leader of China. Now that seems to have taken place, I think the suspicion level would be so high that country probably is out of the running as a legitimate mediator.
Yeah, thanks. Want to give each of you, and Nathan, if you want to as well, a final thought as we wrap up. Is there anything you want to say in terms of summary comment? Nathan, if you wanted to add something as well. Yeah. Give each of you a chance.
Yeah, just this, from my perspective as a historian, I don't want to talk about historical inevitability. It's not like things never change. There are patterns that you keep seeing happen that seem to be kind of endemic in a particular group or situation, or at least in much of Eastern Europe. I've seen that repeatedly in different ways in the various different countries, depending on what their history has been. And as I said at the beginning of the talk tonight, I was very sad and disappointed, but not surprised that Putin took these steps. Yeah. So it kind of fits. I'm hoping there's some kind of way in which this pattern can be broken that's not over the back of Ukraine.
Yeah. Bob, a final thought?
I share the sadness of the professor. Mm-hmm. And I can only hope, I guess, that a majority Christian Western world, and I don't mean, be it Catholic or Protestant or what have you, but just people sharing in the Christian principle that, in fact, people deserve to be treated with humanity, that idea has got to somehow prevail and permit us to, in effect, search our souls and do an awful lot of prayer in terms of trying to come up with solutions. And if in fact our leaders don't appear to be, and if we think we've got some idea that might help, that we in fact engage ourselves with our political representatives and pass those ideas on.
Yeah. Thanks. Nathan, anything you want to add as a summary comment?
Just a thank you. I really appreciate both of you coming here and everybody here coming to listen and ask your questions to provide some clarity to a very unclear situation. I share your hope that somehow it resolves itself, at least somewhat peacefully, or, well, I think that we've passed that, but it resolves itself in such a way that does not see us follow a path that we've followed before. But I want to express my gratitude for both of you being here, for Rick for organizing this, and for everybody coming out tonight and participating.
Let us express our gratitude to our speakers tonight. Jim has brought some copies of his book, which he has available for sale, and he is graciously offering them tonight at $40 a copy, discounted from the $48 that you can get them on Amazon for, and 10 of that will go to the United Church's Ukrainian Relief Fund, but unfortunately you have to pay cash. We were hoping to be set up for plastic tonight, and we're unable to do that, but if you would like to purchase a book tonight from him, and if you do have cash, then we can take care of that. And I want to remind you also that if you want to contribute financially to Ukrainian relief, then you can do so through St. James' website. Again, Google St. James Waterdown, and at the top of the home page you will see a button to say Donate Here. And when you click through to follow the donate button, just put in the note file that it is for Ukrainian relief, and that will be forwarded to the United Church of Canada's Ukrainian Relief Fund. Thank you for giving of your time to be here tonight. Thank you for those of you who shared questions and thoughts, for bringing those with you. Thank you for those of you who are who have joined us online tonight. If you wish to share this with others who weren't able to be here tonight or weren't able to join us online, it will be archived on YouTube, and that will be accessible through the St. James website. So you can watch this again at any point in the future. It'll be on our YouTube channel. I hope you'll indulge me for a closing moment here. As this is a religious institution, I don't presume all of you here have a faith, but those of us who are hosting do, and so I would ask that you indulge a moment, that we stand together and offer a prayer for peace and hope and freedom from tyranny. And you may, I will pray in the language that fits me, but you may feel free to interpret this in whatever way you view the universe, and if you view a higher power, you may feel free to substitute as you wish. Let us bow our heads. Gracious Creator, we face fear in the world. We feel helpless watching the suffering of the people in Ukraine. We fear rampant tyranny, and we pray for an end to hostilities, an end to war, an end to suffering, an end to tyranny. We have the audacity to pray for the restoration of peace and wholeness and the beginning of healing. Amen. Thank you for coming tonight. Take care, drive safe, and God bless.